Welcome to the Australian Property Podcast. I'm Chris Bates. We're on a mission to become Australia's most trusted property podcast. Doing another episode today with Amy Lunardi. How are you doing, Amy?
I'm good, Chris. I'm so glad to just be back into the swing of things after, an extended break from work and podcasting last year. It just gives me energy. I love it. It's good to be back.
So Amy and I booked to do this at 11. We just spent the last 11 minutes chatting about the most strategic time of the week to order your cleaner. I reckon Fridays, so it's nice and tidy on a weekend. Amy likes to get the cleaner on a Monday. So wonder what our listeners think. What's the best day of the week to have a cleaner?
Look, I appreciate that it's a very privileged thing to say that, we have cleaners. I'm totally acknowledging that. That being said, I would rather sacrifice buying new clothes for a whole year than not having my cleaner. It's just such a nice little luxury to have every week.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I 100% agree. It's a $28 T-shirt, and I'd much rather someone help us keep the house clean, especially with two young kids that go around the place and trash it. So,
and I've got two cats as well. That's the load of the mess, I reckon.
Yeah, I've got two cats too, so I forgot to mention that. So we're the same, two kids, two cats. But today's episode, we're going to talk about how to win at auction, which, is probably the most likely way you're going to buy in hot markets, maybe not in sort of slower markets. And
well, it depends where you live, doesn't it, Chris? You're in Sydney, Chris, and I'm in Melbourne, and a lot of properties do go to auction in the inner areas.
Yeah, that's right. Exactly. And I think in different cities around the country, though, auctions weren't a big part of the market, like, for example, Brisbane, but they're growing every year. So how are we going to attack this today, Amy? Because I think it's a great episode for people who are getting ready for an auction, and it's maybe something they want to listen to prior to going to an auction. I think that's a lot of property content, or any content is, it's all relevant, but what's relevant to you right now is different stages of the process. So how are we going to attack it?
Well, let's discuss what an auction is first and foremost, because in our last episode, we talked all about private sales, and there's only two ways a property that can actually sell in Australia. It's either through a private sale or an auction. And private sales, like we spoke about last week, there's not really any rules, even though some people might say, I'd rather buy at private sale because I feel like at auction, anything can happen. And they always hear these runaway auction prices, etc. And first of all, I'll say that's not the case. In my experience, private sales can sell for, just as much. There can be just as much competition. And it's actually more complicated to buy via a private sale because there are no set rules. So with an auction, there are clear and set rules. Everyone should be kind of somewhat familiar with an auction. You go onto eBay or, there's auctions with a lot of things aside from property. But with property, there are set rules. So, it's also much more transparent because when you're at an auction, you can see the other bidders, you can see the other buyers, and you can know exactly how much they're bidding as well.
Yeah, I think there's just a lot of, you can get quite intimidated by it. And even if you haven't, particularly a lot of people go to their auction and the first time they've even been to an auction or the first time they've bidded on the property is the property they fall in love with, right? And so I feel like they're not desensitized to it a little bit, and they haven't gone and watched as many auctions. And a lot of people do say, you're right, I just don't want to buy at auction. I find it really scary. And that doesn't mean you have to do it. You can always engage an expert and I would recommend that personally. But if you are going to do it yourself, I mean, what are some of the other things, the rules, I guess, at auctions that people need to be aware of?
Yeah. So you just need to be aware that there is no cooling off period. So what that means is if you purchase at auction, you can't change your mind afterwards. You can't withdraw from that contract. Whereas with a private sale, depending on which state you're in, you might have a cooling off period. For example, here in Victoria, it's 3 business days from the date that the buyer signs the contract. Bear that in mind, the buyer, not the vendor. So when you buy at auction, you're locked in. And also, you can't be conditional on anything at auction. So you have to be really prepared beforehand, having done your building inspection, making sure you're confident with finance. You can negotiate for amendments to the contract, and you can negotiate for things like, the vendor has to do some repairs prior to settlement. So things that are within the contract that are amended, but you can't exit the contract later on if you don't get finance, for example. So really important to understand, no cooling off. You're locked in. You can't be conditional upon anything.
And if, for example, a property doesn't sell though at the auction and it passes in, I mean, that you can potentially cool off if the highest bidder though, right? So I think how does that sort of work and how should we
Yeah.
explain that?
That's a great question. So let's just discuss how an auction works. So with an auction, the vendor is going to have a reserve price. Now, this is, it's all fair, easy to say, oh, the vendor just has a reserve price and they set that at the start of the auction campaign and that's going to be the reserve on auction day. And the reserve price is essentially the minimum that they're happy to sell for. But the vendor is actually allowed to change their mind on what their reserve price at any point in time during that campaign and even during the auction. And sometimes they might have a couple of different strategies and they might say to the agent, look, if we've got lots of competitive bidding, my reserve price is this amount. But if we've only really got one really strong bidder, let's have the reserve a bit higher so we can pass it into them and negotiate. So even though in some situations it's straightforward, just bear in mind that the reserve can be flexible and the vendor can change it. But if bidding, just say there's no bidding or bidding doesn't get to the reserve price and exceed the reserve price, then what will happen is the property will pass in. It's called pass in. And it'll pass into the highest bidder. And that bidder has the exclusive right to negotiate with the vendor. And if they can't reach an agreement, then it will either go up to a private sale or they'll go and negotiate with other bidders if there were other bidders there. So it's really important to understand the multiple different scenarios which can happen at an auction, which is it might either sell to someone once the property bidding has met reserve, or it'll potentially pass in. And you need to be prepared for a pass-in situation just in case that does happen.
So let's say we are expecting the property to, sell and it go past the reserve. I mean, when clients come to you and say, how do I win at auction? What do you say?
Well, there's one way that you can be guaranteed to win at auction. What do you reckon that is, Chris?
Have unlimited budget.
Yeah. So I'm just being a bit facetious here. Well, that's really the only way you can be absolutely guaranteed to win at auction is just have the most money.
Yeah.
But it's not always the case. I've had plenty of situations where I've either had clients come and engage me and they've said, oh, we went to this auction and we could have gone higher, but we didn't go higher and we regret doing that. Or I'll win at auction and have another underbidder engage me after that to bid for them another time. And they did have more budget. And I said to them, why didn't you keep bidding? They said, oh, we didn't really have a plan, or we thought you would keep on going. We didn't think we had a chance. So it's not always the case that the person with the most money will buy the property, and all of the more reason why you have to have a plan going into this. So It's not just have the most money. And also, like we said before, auctions aren't necessarily always runaway. So please don't let them put you off. There are a lot of ways that you can prepare for an auction, which we're going to run through in a moment.
So you've been part of probably thousands of auctions. That's probably not an exaggeration. People say those things, but you probably have. And do you think that a lot of the way that you approach it and the mindset and how you rock up as a bidder and how you handle yourself through the bidding can have an impact? Or do you ultimately feel that it's only a minor impact on whether you're going to get it or not, and often it is down to who's just sort of set the highest price in their mind? Or, can you really win an auction by just getting your mindset right and the way that you bid by scaring off other buyers, I guess?
Well, who's to say? Because whenever I've won at auction, I never know what other bidders were going to pay. So I can't really say, 80% of the time, yes, and 20% no. However, because I've seen those situations where I've seen other people who genuinely haven't gone to the top of their limit because they weren't prepared or they were nervous or for whatever reason, yes, I would say it definitely gives you a competitive advantage if you're really, really prepared. So let's go through the way that you prepare for an auction and all of the different steps that you need to take. I'll give you my biggest tips so that if you're going to an auction this weekend or in a couple of weeks or at some point in the future, you can be really, really ready. So first of all, though, you need to speak to your mortgage broker. Why do we have to speak to our broker at the start, Chris?
Oh, look, I think you definitely want to know absolute max. And I think that's the way that we approach our mortgage strategies as brokers, right? Is let's figure out what you can do, what your limit is, so you really understand that. And if you want to buy well within your speed limit, right? And that's fine. And I think prior to the auction day, though, is if you feel like you're going to be able to stretch your limit, is just do a double check in and go, look, if we've got a client trying to buy something in 2 days' time, right? This is what I'm thinking. I haven't been looking for a while. Can you just really refresh me on my current max? Because lending's always changing. So I think that's the real benefit. And also sometimes the property you're buying, or the structure that you want to do, or maybe it needs a reno. So you've got to make sure you can buy it, but you can also got funds to do a reno. And every property is a little bit different, that sometimes you want to sense check with us.
Yeah, I always suggest just touching base with the broker, first of all, for all those reasons, to make sure your pre-approval is still relevant, nothing's changed, your circumstances, etc. But also you should just run that property past them just to make sure there's nothing quirky about it, which could impact your loan. For example, if it's not standard residential zoning, or if it's like a really small 1-bedroom apartment and it needs to be a certain minimum size for your pre-approval, all of these things just to triple check, just in case it's going to impact your loan. So when you first find a property that you're keen to go for, touch base with your broker, make sure you're all good on that front. And then I would always recommend at the very beginning, talking to the agent and just understanding if there's any risk of that property selling prior to auction. And that's because you might say, okay, this property is going to auction in 3.5 weeks. You put it in your diary. You say, oh, that's plenty of time to do my due diligence. But then the agent calls you 2 days later and says, hey, Chris, I've got an offer on this property. It's going to sell in 24 hours. Are you in or out? And that would just be devastating if you were really keen on that property and you just couldn't participate because you weren't ready. So I always say to the agent, and this isn't necessarily me at this point saying, hey, I want to put an offer in prior. The language that I use, the phrase that I use is I say, just so I can get ready in time, is this property definitely 100% going to auction, or is there a risk of it selling beforehand? Because in some cases, they might say, no, it has to go to auction. It's, an executor's estate, or there's multiple parties involved for whatever reason, and then you've got a bit of time. But they might say, oh, look, the vendor is actually open to offers. We've got a few other people talking about offers. Whatever they say, if they suggest it could sell prior, you need to get ready as soon as possible.
I think that's such a key point, right? Because a lot of people do see it on the Saturday, auction's 3 weeks out, and their life takes over on a Monday, and all of a sudden it's Thursday, Friday, and bang, an offer hits, and they just haven't thought about it. And maybe they haven't done all the due DD, and they have to make a quick decision, and the fear of missing out, and then all of a sudden they're making offers and they are just missing that step, which is so important. We're not going to talk about DD too much today in terms of what you need to do, but because we'll cover that in other episodes. But
but it's doing all your due diligence, getting your building inspection done, doing that as quick as possible, just in case you've got further investigations required, all of those things up front so that you're ready. And then your own personal due diligence, like, your appraisal, figuring out how much that property is worth. So again, if you have to make a decision really quickly, you're not scrambling and self-doubting yourself because you haven't had time to put all of that research in. So absolutely do all of that up front. And later in this episode, we're also going to talk about buying prior to auction as well. So just say that property is definitely going to auction, then we need to do all of our due diligence up front. And also that includes confirming your terms before settlement too. Don't expect to rock up on auction day and buy at auction and then say, oh, by the way, I need 120-day settlement. And they say, well, that's not agreed to. You didn't run that past us first. So you need to confirm settlement, what's on offer, and confirm that in writing with them ideally. And then also the deposit, especially if you've got less than a 10% deposit, you need to have that approved before the auction. Just get an understanding of how that deposit is paid. Maybe you need to increase your transfer limit for the day just to be fully prepared. Or special conditions that you want amended or included. All of this has to be confirmed up front because it's not a guarantee or a given on auction day. And I had one auction where we were bidding. We ended up being the underbidder. That means we were the second highest bidder. And we were really disappointed. And, we had a chat out the front and we started to leave. And the agent called me and she said, are you still here? And I said, yeah. Why? She said, well, this bidder who's bought the property has just come inside and asked for a 4-month settlement, the vendor can't do that. They need 30 to 60 days like you'd already agreed to. Do you still want the property? So we ended up buying that property because that other person was unable to do that shorter settlement. So even though he just came in just assuming that, she'll be right, I'll be able to deal with this afterwards. But it's not always going to be the case.
God, I wonder if that person really needed a longer settlement or just wanted to get out of that property. But I wouldn't recommend being that person. Amy's obviously swooped in, but that person, that is not a good strategy. I mean, they could have been in all sorts of trouble there, basically winning that at auction and then asking for a longer settlement after. Not a good move. So, I mean, I think getting that number right prior to auction date rather than mid-auction, right? You see the two partners together, spend a bit more. They're all flustered. They know their way past their limits. Their body language is showing that they're near the finish line. They keep upping it. How do you approach or sort of get buyers in the right mindset, the night before the auction? And what do you recommend?
Okay, so all of this happens way before the night prior to auction. We start figuring out how much this property is worth and what we're going to spend on it right at the very beginning. So we start off, and this is what I do, but this is what you should be doing as a buyer as well, by doing your comparable sales analysis and saying, okay, well, what do I think this property is worth based on comparable sales? I then overlay that with like a current market analysis. What's happening in the current market? Is it going up? Is it going down? What are the other competing properties on the market at the moment? And when are they going to auction? And how do I think that will influence the buyer pool or the buyer numbers at this particular property? And then the final layer on all of that is how much should you stretch for that property? So how much over that appraised limit is appropriate as a competitive stretch? Because otherwise, if you're going to auction just with the appraised value, you're just kind of relying on a bit of hope, which is fine. Or maybe you need to factor in certain costs of renovations and upfront work, which of course is fine. But if you're going there and this property ticks all of your boxes and you've been looking for a little while, or that's very scarce type of property that's not going to be easily replicable, well, then you might want to go with a competitive stretch. So you need all of that time prior to auction to figure that out and go backwards and forwards and talk to your partner about it and talk to your broker, etc. You don't want to be doing this the morning of the auction or even the night before, and certainly during the auction. And I have seen, I reckon half of auctions I go to when I'm bidding against people, I see them pause and stop, maybe talk to their partner, get on the phone to parents, or just slow down because they haven't really figured out what their absolute walkaway number is. And for that reason, sometimes they go too high and they go more than what they wanted to. But in many instances, they stop and don't keep going. And then after the auction, they say, oh, I probably would have paid that price if I put more effort and time into it. So my number one tip beyond anything else is to have that walk away, no regret, not spending another dollar on this property price set before the auction, and just stick to that limit. And then beyond that, there are other strategies, how much bidding increments you do and where you stand and all of those things. But I would say if you're an inexperienced bidder, which most people are, don't overthink it because you'll just stress yourself out. Just have your limit and then bid as confidently, as loudly as you can up to that limit. But even if you're nervous, just put your hand up, stand near the agent, make sure they can see you, but just don't overthink it. Don't let your dad or your friend or whoever say, oh, don't kick the auction off or bid in these increments or try and break it down to $1,000 or whatever it is. Yes, there are strategies which people like me implement as buyer's agents. But if you overthink it too much, then that can actually be more stressful for you.
Yeah, I think the no regrets dollar is something that you got to sort of test as well. I think you definitely don't want any regrets regarding the property that you purchase. But let's say it is the right property for you. What you may not be happy with is the price that you pay. The reality is everyone wants a bargain in life. They want to get it at a price they're super happy with and they can say, I've got an amazing property, I got it for an amazing price. It's just the reality is good assets often don't go for the price that you want. And it might not go for the price that you think it's worth as well. They usually sometimes run because competition forces it beyond what is probably fair value because two people really want it. That's how prices of things go up. And I think what you really want to do is what's the price where maybe you're unhappy with the price, but you're not like regretting the price you paid because it's put you into financial stress, or it just feels way above what it's actually worth, or you love the property, but you just really hate the mortgage that you've got now and it's just too much. So, I would role play that out personally. I don't know if you'd recommend the same thing, Amy,
Yeah.
where you maybe say it's $1 million and you say, well, what happens if it was $1,050,000? Would you regret it? And maybe you thought it first, but when you had to role play that out in your mind and woke up the next day, you might say, yeah, I still think I'd love that property. And so I think it's that price there where you're unhappy, but you're not like devastated that you sort of still, you overstretched.
Yeah, we always do various different scenarios. So when we do that original analysis at the start, that helps us form the benchmark of all of these scenarios. And then we say, okay, what do we reckon would be a bit of a bargain, a great price, a great scenario for this property? What do we reckon is fair market value? It's usually a range. It's not like a, $967,000 situation. And then we say, okay, where do we feel like this can get to under competition? And then the final is, well, what's the maximum we're prepared to pay, factoring in all of those personal things, how perfect is it? How scarce is it? All of those extra layers, because this will then help you set that limit. And of course, you don't want to push yourself to a point where financially it's incredibly uncomfortable, but we stress test it and we say, okay, well, what's a price we wouldn't pay? And then sometimes we work down from there. Or what's a price we can't pay? Some people are just constrained by budget and that's it. That's all that they can go to. So yes, we workshop various scenarios with all of this. And this also helps you as well so that you have a plan, or ideally you can start making a plan in case that property does pass in, because I've been to plenty of auctions where I expect it to pass in because the agent has given me a heads up and said, hey, Amy, I think I don't really have any other bidders, or the vendor's reserve is probably going to be higher than, where it should be. Or sometimes we expect competition and people just don't rock up. Like anything can happen at an auction. So then you have to have a plan. And one of my hot tips here with a pass-in is don't let the lack of other bidding or the lack of social proof then influence your decision-making, because it's very common for buyers to then say, oh, well, what's wrong with this property? Why is nobody else bidding? Why is no one bidding at this price? And we say, no, we've come into this with a plan. You've got to see it as an opportunity. And if you've done all of your due diligence prior and all of your budget setting, that really needs to then influence your negotiation strategy. And then in that situation, you need to negotiate, go backwards and forwards, and basically until the agent's almost letting you walk away. And that's kind of when you know that that's the bottom price the vendor will accept on that day, and you can decide whether you're prepared to pay that or not. But these situations can be very high pressure. It's very nerve-wracking. You're dealing with an expert negotiator at the agent. So another word of advice here is just to take a moment and, don't necessarily answer the agent on the spot if they're saying things to you. Just say, hey, I've got to go outside. Just let me think about it for a second. Let me call my broker. Let me call a friend. You don't actually have to. Just pretend, just so you can think about your strategy, and just don't be put too much on the spot and say something that you haven't thought through.
Yeah, I mean, I think I say similar things to clients is when they're getting ready for auctions, right? They've got that price. Whether you can win an auction by increasing your bid to a strange number like they do on the block, or, standing in the right position and wearing sunglasses and, you know what I mean? There's so many things that people sort of, throw out there, saying crazy bids, or, asking if it's on the market, and, all sorts of random things you can sort of do. I think ultimately just being really confident and working your way up to that limit. Is that sort of when you said don't overthink it, is that sort of the mindset you try to get a lot of you're doing a lot of auction bidding for your clients, but if you weren't helping them, that's what you'd recommend?
Yeah, absolutely. That's the most thing within your control. All of the other strategy things are hypothetical. I do know that there's a common saying, don't be the first one to kick off the auction. I don't see the logic behind that. It does depend on the start price point and where you're trying to end, et cetera. There's a bit of nuance there. But if you can start off the auction at a reasonable price and you've got plenty left in the tank, and I see no reason not to do that, especially if you're nervous, because it almost like relieves the bit of this pressure built up to say, okay, I've got my bid in at least. The agent knows I'm participating, and then you can just take it from there. So, and also like, people talk about slam bids and quirky numbers, all of these things. Just don't overthink it too much. And slam bidding, I'm not a huge fan of that strategy.
Yeah, or like the sniper strategy. I have seen that work, to be
Coming
honest.
in last minute.
Yeah. And I've
Chris.
seen the sniper false fire as well. Right. So I've seen ones where I'm like, this auction is over. You've got two bidders that are flushed, they're red faced, they're like stressed, they're both like competing against each other. They're like, we need a family home, like they're pregnant, they're just there's like, you can see the emotion, and all of a sudden they feel like they've won it. And then, a guy pops up in the kitchen and says, 1.25, and they're like at 1.2 or something. And then they're like, oh my God. And then they just deflate. And then this person makes one bid and wins it. Like, but I've also seen.
But I would look at that and I would say that guy's probably paid 45 grand more than he needed to. So even though they might come in, look, I've won the auction. I did a slam bid. I was a sniper. I came in at the end. Well, was that necessary? Not necessarily. If you'd bid really strategically and confidently from the start, maybe you could have knocked these people out sooner. So
true. Like,
and
that
also,
person,
Chris,
yeah.
I've seen, oh my gosh, I was at this one auction where someone tried the sniper attack and accidentally called out their bid after the auctioneer had called the auction down in a hammer. They're not allowed to accept that bid. So that was a strategy gone completely awry.
I saw that as well. I was in Preston in Victoria.
You saw it?
Yeah, and he's cool dude. He had his leather jacket on, and his Wayfarer sunnies, and he's and he was really, really confident, and he just sat there with his hands in his pockets, and he wasn't bidding, right? He was doing this sniper strategy, going once, going twice, going 3 times, and he literally said it after he said sold.
Yeah,
and then he stormed off and went to his car and sped off. And I was like, mate, like, what were you thinking?
It's crazy. So I mean, if you don't want to kick the auction off, that's fine. But don't try and do that and leave it till a third and final call. Like, it's not worth the risk.
Yeah.
So
I think you've got to get the agent and the auctioneer on side. That's why I personally quite like bidding first, is that, and not trying to, it's on the market at $1 million and you say 400,000, like, you're just going to upset them. But, so you've got to be reasonable.
They're just going to not take your bid.
Yeah,
They'll just vendor bid on top of you. So a vendor bid is something we haven't really discussed. And I know in other states, there's rules around vendor bidding, like you can only put one vendor bid in. But here in Victoria, you can do as many vendor bids as you want. And a vendor bid is essentially the agent making a bid on behalf of the vendor to either start the auction, or if the original bid is just far too far away from the range, just to get it closer to the vendor's expectations. But nothing will happen if no one bids over that. It'll pass in, and it'll pass into basically anyone who wants to negotiate. So it's really just like a way to keep the auction tracking along. Agents don't want to do vendor bids. They'd rather genuine bidding, but sometimes it's necessary. So just so you understand what that means, that's called a vendor bid.
Yeah, the vendor can't buy the property from themselves. And then pay stamp duty. So I don't think that's going to happen. So don't be too concerned if you're losing to the vendor. But
you can also, here's another little hot tip, Chris. You can actually match a vendor bid. So if the agent says, okay, I'm placing a vendor bid of $1 million, you don't necessarily have to go above that. You can, if, again, you're still well within your budget and it's a reasonable price. Otherwise, you can say, okay, well, I'll match your bid of $1 million. Most agents will accept it. Some of them might be a bit stubborn and say, nope, not accepting that. You have to increase increments. So just so you can understand, that is something that you can do and you can offer during an auction.
Yeah, and if you haven't get engaged a buyer's agent, I don't know if you offer this service, Amy, but a lot of buyer's agents around the country will do auction bidding for you if they've got the time. Yeah. I mean, it won't be super expensive, but there'll be a cost to it. But if it fits into their Saturday and what they're looking to do for their other clients, then maybe they're able to help you. And
that's right.
Don't be scared of asking buyer's agents, even if you're not engaging their full service, because a lot of them will factor it in. Try to get it in on their Saturday, and just help you get ready for the auction as well. And maybe they don't win, and maybe you're confident to do it the next time, so you don't have to engage them for every auction.
That's a good point. So I've got my bidding only, where I just rock up and bid, and I've got the budget. I've done no due diligence for them or auction prep work. And then I've got a level of service where I will do all the due diligence. I'll do the appraisal, have those strategy sessions on, where we're seeing value. I help them put an offer in prior. I put an offer in on a property last night. Now we're doing a little mini auction tonight. So yes, there's various levels of service. with a buyer's agent. And furthermore to that, buying prior to auction. So this is something I think we do need to finish up this episode with, because it's a bit of a complicated process. In other words, it's like you're buying an auction property, but almost becomes a private sale in some situations. So I'll just explain. I'll explain the strategy behind it. But Chris, have you done this before? Have you had many clients with success buying prior to auction?
Yeah, absolutely right. Like I think there's always depending on how hot the property is, but sometimes you just want to secure that property, and you can sort of go in with the no regrets price, because you're just like, well, I just want to put all my eggs on the table and just say, I'm going in on this. And hopefully you find a vendor that's motivated to just take that bird in the hand rather than take the risk of going to auction and may or may not beat your price. I think that's where I think it really powerful is that, or you just know it's not likely to, go to auction, and you can sort of come on in and take advantage of a campaign that you think's not going that well, and surprise, where they go, oh, I don't really want to go to auction, and have no one rock up. And so the shame of running an auction. So that's where I've seen
the shame, Chris.
Yeah. Well, I think people care. People do, like, they don't want there's so much pride and emotional attachment people have got to property, I believe, that they don't really want to have all their neighbours and their people coming in and doing open homes, let alone rocking up at auction and see the property not sell.
Well, okay. So let's focus on a vendor perspective first, because you're right. Some vendors don't necessarily care about going all the way through to auction. They might care about at least having one or two open so that they feel confident that they've had exposure and they've tested the market, but they're happy to accept an offer prior because it's a bird in the hand for them versus, because if you might have a couple of key interested buyers after the second open, they're not guaranteed to be around by auction day. So if you've got someone or a couple of people who are at the right price level, then you might just, as a vendor, prefer to sell it beforehand and bring it forward, essentially. And some vendors just like that idea as well, because in some situations it's a little bit less stressful.
Yeah.
But some vendors might say, oh, yeah, I'd be happy to sell prior, but it would need to be well above the price I'd consider selling for an auction day, because it's them saying, okay, well, I'm not going to get my day in the sun at auction and the chance for, this a higher result. So their reserve on auction day might be 700, but to sell prior, they might want 730 or 750 or whatever it is. And then you need to make a decision on whether that's worthwhile. So from a buyer's perspective, one of the key benefits of buying prior to auction will be to minimize competition if you can take other buyers by surprise and eliminate other buyers who maybe aren't ready yet. Because depending where you are and depending on the agent's process, if you put an offer in, for example, I put an offer in on a property yesterday at about 4:30 p.m. It was considered acceptable at 5 p.m. They're having that auction tonight. So it's only really 24 hours where other buyers have to get ready for that. And if they aren't ready, they don't have their finance yet, or they just haven't had time, or if it's all feeling too rushed for them, then that could potentially reduce our competition. It can go both ways, because sometimes, if you waited longer, you just don't know all of the different buyers that are coming in and out of the market. But that's one of the key benefits. But also, it's just a case to say, okay, by bringing this auction forward, it means if we miss out, we can just move on sooner. We're not waiting 4 weeks. We've got other properties that we want to buy. We've got other considerations, and we can just be put out of our misery sooner. So there's key benefits and not often disadvantages, but one really, really important thing, Chris, that everyone needs to be aware of is if you buy prior to auction, you might end up in a situation which is not transparent. And in which case, this can be tricky, because that agent might say, okay, well, we're happy to sell prior to auction, but everyone then has to give us their best offer and you just get one shot. Well, you might not necessarily want to put yourself in that situation.
I do think you've got to have a leap of faith, I think, in that A, it's a great property for you, and B, you're just buying it based on the terms that you're happy with, and you don't get that sort of transparency what an auction does, where you can see how many people really want it and what you're actually getting a fair price because someone else wanted it for the same price you got. So you almost walk away, I feel, after an auction and go, yeah, that was a hot property. Everyone wanted it. So when I sell it one day, it's going to be a hot property. Sometimes I guess when you haven't seen it, go through that, I do feel like it's a leap of faith sometimes. And you just got to go, well, I'm buying this on terms that I'm happy with. And you just sometimes never know whether there was anyone else interested or, there's just no transparency there.
Well, yeah, and it depends. And this is why it's important for you to ask questions before you put an offer in, always. So you kind of go back to that private sale episode and you have to ask all of those questions to understand, okay, well, if this property sells prior, whether it's to me or whether it's to someone else, what will the process be from there? And they might say, okay, well, that it would just be a best and highest situation. Or they might say, well, we'll just go backwards and forwards on the phone until everyone's out. I don't mind that situation at all. Like it's not transparent into the fact that I can't see the other people. But it's extremely rare for an agent to be bluffing in that situation once the vendor has said yes to the original acceptable offer, because it's the agent's risk then if they're bluffing and the other buyer doesn't increase their offer. They got no offers. It's just a silly thing. So I'm okay with that. Or other times they'll just bring the auction forward, like this one I'm going to tonight. They're just bringing it forward. That might be a boardroom auction or a Zoom auction or at the property, and then it is transparent.
Yeah.
So you've got to ask what their process is, and then you can decide if you're wanting to participate in that process. And a best and highest situation can actually be advantageous for you if you have a pretty high confidence that that property will probably go over your budget, and then you have nothing to lose putting your best offer forward. And it might actually give you an advantage because other people might not feel comfortable putting their top offer forward or a price they would have spent at auction because of the lack of transparency. So there's a bit of strategy involved here.
Yeah, I'm just sort of reminds me of when the place I'm literally in right now, we bought in 2022, we upgraded and, the dream property on the, literally something I drove past and said like we wanted to be in and, it came on when we were looking and, the risk of it going to an auction was just so great that, we saw it on the Friday, might even been the Saturday, we saw it again and we were making offers on that weekend and, we sort of bought it on the Monday. We just didn't want to give anyone a chance. And this was actually pre-market. They were going to make it live on the Thursday, but we ended up getting to see it on the Friday before. And, so that's one of the benefits sometimes as well is that you just don't want this to get on the market or get too many people looking at it because it's going to run. I just think with a lot of people waiting for auctions around, I see it all the time is you're right, they don't get their DD ready because they're waiting 3 weeks and then they lose it, or they wait till that auction. They've thought about the furniture. They've spent all this time visualizing the life and walking in the suburb, and then they just don't get ready on auction day, or they never had the budget to actually buy it because it just was too hot and it was just just thought it would go for less. And then they're back looking at square one and they wait another month to look at another one. And sometimes just
it delays everything.
Chasing the rabbit. And selling seasons are quite short, really. It's not always 24/7, 365 days a year. Properties are on. They sort of go in cycles. And all of a sudden you can be getting late in a spring or an auction campaign and going, oh no, we've just missed out on 2 auctions and bang, you're waiting another 3 months till good stuff comes on again. And so just be really careful chasing rabbits that you may not ever get.
Yeah. So with this whole buying prior to auction, there's kind of 2 main things here you need to focus on. First of all is understanding the process with asking as many questions as possible about, okay, if someone does something prior, what's the process, and also how quickly will everyone have to participate? Is it going to be a couple of hours, 24 hours, 48 hours? That'll influence your strategy. But then also you need to understand at what price the vendor will sell prior. This is especially challenging if that vendor's sell it before auction price is quite a lot higher than what they want to sell on auction day, because the agent then doesn't want to suggest to that buyer that, the property's like underquoted, or it can just become really, really tricky here. So there's a lot of tact with this. So I'll be saying to the agent, does the vendor have a particular price that they'd sell prior at? If the agent's just then saying, oh, well, you tell me, you tell me what you're thinking, I'm never going to I don't really want to commit to anything there just in case they say no. I still want to keep my cards a bit close to my chest for auction day. So I really want to get it from them. And there might be a little bit of a dance, like they're just kind of implying at the start until they realize you're really serious. because also selling prior to auction does introduce an element of risk to the vendor too, because here in Victoria, for example, if you buy a property prior to auction, beyond 3 business days prior to an auction, so just say it goes to auction next Saturday, you buy it on the Monday, you've then got a cooling off period. So that's a risk to that vendor too. So agents have to be really careful with selling prior. They've got to know that, whoever's going to do this is really serious. There's no risk of cooling off. It's not going to muck their strategy up. So just understand it can be a little bit more complicated, but you do want to get at least as much commitment as you can from the agent about a price that would trigger it prior, and then understanding the process. So those are the 2 key things you need to understand if you're buying prior to auction, and then you can decide if you want to go down that path or just wait until the auction day. What
a great episode, Amy. Thank you so much.
I love auctions, by the way, if you couldn't tell.
Yeah, you've seen a few, and I think if you are a buyer, just try to get to some as well. Like even if the more experience you can see, the more that you sort of feel it. Maybe the first auction is really exciting, and every time you go, it's less and less exciting, and so maybe you're more and more comfortable to bid. And hopefully that was really valuable. And thanks for your time, Amy.
Great tip, Chris. No problem. All right, catch you later.
Talk soon.
Thanks for watching this video on the Rask Network. While you're here, don't forget to like and subscribe so you can get videos each and every day on business, finance, investing, and so much more.